Alright, so most of you watching this probably already know this, but I'm gonna go over it again just so the new people can keep up, okay? Isekai is a Japanese word that roughly translates into English as different world. The description encapsulates Japanese fiction, most commonly light novels, manga and anime, which generally revolve around at least one individual finding themselves within a world different to their original one. From this point, the genre, such as it is, begins to branch out a bit. The concept of isekai, whilst currently experiencing high levels of popularity, is not a recent invention and can be traced back to Japanese folklore. Whilst the term isekai is Japanese in origin and is commonly used in reference to Japanese media, the concept of a protagonist being transported to a different world is more universal. If you looked hard enough, you could find myths and legends from the West that share a lot of similarities with isekai, dating back to Greek myths of heroes on noble quests travelling to the underworld, although these do tend to miss a few common features of modern isekai storytelling. Some of the more popular examples of the transported to another world trope amongst Western literature are probably Alice in Wonderland, The Wizard of Oz, Peter Pan, and The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Each of these stories revolve around one or more kids being whisked away into a world of fantasy and being caught up in wacky hijinks until they are returned home having learned some important moral lesson. These stories notably differ from modern Japanese isekai storytelling in a number of key respects, however. The most notable, I would argue, is that the protagonists get to return home in the end.
At the core of these stories lies a general structure that aligns more or less with the storytelling sandwich that Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. I could quickly run through the steps this model involves, but there are a bunch of other people who have already done that way better than I ever could. So I'm just going to draw attention to the most relevant parts, which is the 3 acts of the journey. The hero's journey is like a sandwich in that it has 3 basic components, with the first and third acts taking place in the ordinary world and acting as bookends to hold in place the second act in the middle, which takes place in the special world, is where all the juicy, meaty, good stuff is. Or if you're a story vegetarian, where all the wholesome, fulfilling sweet bits are. Acting as the bread of the sandwich, the first and third acts are vital to hold the second act together neat and tidily, and not just be a messy pile of meat and or salad on the plate, and also to take the meal as a whole and make it more accessible and easier to consume. The general process is this. Protagonist begins story in ordinary world. Protagonist enters special world. Protagonist returns to the ordinary world, usually with some reward from the special world. That's a gross oversimplification of the process, but that's the part that is most important for this discussion, and I'm taking too much time rambling about this nonsense as it is. Where Isekai differs is that the trend right now is to cut off as much of these 2 sandwich bread slices from the story as possible. The protagonist in modern Isekai spends as little time in the ordinary world as possible, taking as few of the steps Campbell lays out in the hero's journey as necessary, and rushing straight to the crossing of the threshold. As for the third act, well, it's just completely chopped off. Whereas the general definition of isekai simply requires that another world be involved, most modern isekai stories you'll find today have the protagonist trapped in their new reality, with no prospect or possibility of returning home. Instead, most of these stories appear set up to be able to simply repeat the second act over and over again, ad infinitum, with ever-increasing stakes, until the author either writes themselves into a corner and bails out with a bullshit ending, or simply gets bored and goes on permanent hiatus. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah. So basically, the structure of an isekai is a whole lot of special world main course piled on your plate, with just a few small chunks of ordinary world either presented at the beginning as an appetizer or sprinkled on top as flavouring. As such, the most crucial defining aspect of modern isekai is the crossing of the threshold stage, which should be at the end of the first act but has now moved straight to the beginning. It is very important that the protagonist crosses a very literal physical threshold into a wildly different reality as well. Most stories will have a metaphorical crossing of the threshold, but in isekai, the protagonist should be forcibly abducted from their daily lives and flung almost immediately into a life or death situation. We've got to keep these stories entertaining after all. Can't risk letting all that dull, boring, everyday stuff bore our audience within the first 5 minutes. There's no way we could use the ordinary world setting as a grounded and relatable starting point to explore our protagonists in their comfort zone, allow it to act as a contrast with the crazy world they will find themselves in, or even use the character's background to inform the character's behaviour and decision making throughout the story. Instead, let's give the audience narrative whiplash by skipping over all that build-up and get straight into the action with a protagonist they know nothing about, other than he's probably an incredibly ordinary Japanese high school boy. Sorry about that, I got a little ahead of myself again. Let's move on to something else, shall we?
Before I start breaking out my flowchart of all the different types of isekai, we need to start at the very top of the list. So far, I've been describing isekai in its most common form, where one or more individuals from an ordinary world are transported to a special world. There's a side grade of this genre known as reverse isekai. Despite how it might sound, these are not stories about a special world suddenly being transported to an ordinary individual, although I would be very interested to see how that would be pulled off. Instead, these are stories that involve one or more individuals from one or more special worlds being transported to an ordinary world. Although I call this a side grade, it is a much less popular genre than original brand isekai. From there, isekai can largely be divided by means of transportation for the protagonist. You'd think that it would be by setting, which would largely inform the theme, structure and tone of the story, but you'd be wrong because the setting is always fantasy. Every isekai is set in a fantasy world, and there are no isekai that take place in any other setting. If you claim otherwise, you're lying. Plain and simple. Do you understand? Good. Then moving on. The two most common forms of transporting your cardboard cutout isekai protagonist into their new environment are summoning and reincarnation, with a little wiggle room available for writers to get creative if they really want to be that guy. In theory, these are two distinct subgenres of isekai, each with their own framework and narrative structure to approach the isekai genre from. This is a lie. Whether your protagonist is summoned or reincarnated is likely to only influence the starting location, first objective, and initial power dynamics of the story, all of which will quickly become streamlined into the same plotline checklist of all the other isekai stories. You could typically expect a protagonist who is summoned to another world to have been brought there by a summoner, or a specific purpose, and for the summoner to be more powerful and knowledgeable than the protagonist, and therefore fulfill the role of a guide, mentor, quest giver, and or superior. Reincarnated heroes, however, are more likely to arrive in their new setting without explanation, in a random location, and left to survive and forge relationships with other people of their own accord. This predisposition, however, does break down in a number of cases. There are isekai stories where the summoned individual from the ordinary world is inferior to the summoner's expectations, or otherwise unwanted, and is left to fend for themselves in their new environment. In other stories, the summoner in question might be an idiot, or have somehow isekai'd the protagonist by accident, in which case the pre-assumed purpose and power dynamic aspects are immediately disrupted. Likewise, reincarnated protagonists might have the chance to prepare before being sent to their new home, and therefore get a chance to avoid much of the shock and confusion they would otherwise experience. Regardless of how your protagonist gets to their fantasy worlds, they are still going to end up completing the isekai checklist anyway, so you might as well not care too much about how they got there in the first place. After all, who cares about the means by which one can transport themselves between universes, or the long-term impact such a shocking shift in environment would have on the human psyche, or how someone who has only just discovered a new world in its various cultures might struggle to find a place within them when they spent their whole lives assimilating into and preparing to work as part of a completely different society. None of these questions actually matter, because what you didn't realize is that the isekai protagonist isn't its own category of character. They're actually just the generic fantasy protagonist wearing a funny hat. So let's stop beating around the bush here. Isekai has become something of a dirty word in anime and manga circles these days. This is largely due to there being a lot of derivative, unoriginal, repetitive works filling out the genre at the moment. I was making light of it before, but you really would be hard-pressed to find an isekai story that wasn't set in a fantasy world, doesn't have an overpowered teenage protagonist, have some assortment of 3 to 20 highly attractive love interests that all borrow from the same popular trope Lucky Dip, or a combination of the three.
The market for isekai has become incredibly saturated, and with that saturation has come a lack of variation, with most isekai stories only being able to differentiate themselves from each other with a single small twist on a very well-known formula. The situation is bad enough in the anime industry, where viewers can now expect to have a few new isekai anime being released every season. Whilst I can only guess as to the extent the genre started to dominate the manga and light novel industries, there are even more isekai stories to be found there. And it really is a shame that an entire genre can almost be ruined like this, because isekai itself, as I previously mentioned, is really a very broad genre that could allow for an infinite number of possible stories. Isekai in itself isn't inherently flawed, it's just that right now the industry seems obsessed with trying to recreate the success and acclaim of its most popular titles without actually trying to understand what made those stories worthwhile in the first place. I can't even blame them for trying, really. Despite the word isekai being enough to make the type of person who spends their time watching videos of other people monologue about anime tropes and roll their eyes in disdain, the genre is still really popular. It's no surprise really that anime studios and manga houses keep paying for these stories to be produced, because quite frankly, it's safe money. Isekais to otakus were the big summer action blockbusters to Hollywood. The products they produce don't have to be good, they just have to be out there. People will still sit and watch it because it's a few hours of mindless spectacle. That's really all most people are looking for. If somewhere along the way the product actually turns out to be really good and worthy of popularity and acclaim, well, that's just a bonus.
The question then really is, how did we get here? Well, that sounds like too broad a question for me to answer with any degree of accuracy without going into depth on an abundance of psychological, sociological, and economic aspects of Japan and its history. So I'm instead going to cop myself out of that nonsense and rephrase the question as, what is the appeal of isekai? Or, more accurately, why are people still watching this garbage? Honestly, I personally believe that most modern isekai stories benefit from the sort of hybrid nature of the genre. The majority of isekai stories you will find will be rooted in traditional fantasy settings, with maybe the occasional twist to stand out from the rest. But isekai has managed to set itself apart from the fantasy genre and arguably outgrown it in terms of popularity. I believe this is partly because isekai stories generally pull on all the appealing aspects of a fantasy story, then add a little bit extra on top of them. Fantasy stories are popular for a wide number of reasons, and I would be hesitant to claim that I knew all the major aspects that contribute to the genre's popularity, but I think there are a few that would be obvious to anyone. First and foremost, fantasy offers the audience a chance to experience a story in a world completely unlike their own. Any number of wildly imaginative magics or wickedly impressive technologies are available in these settings without much limit on the audience's suspension of disbelief. So long as the creator can imagine it, there's room for it in the world they're creating. This provides some of the best opportunities for escapism of any medium or genre, and those looking to switch off from the world for an hour, or to explore something completely new and different, won't find many better places to look. Secondly, fantasy offers the same opportunity for spectacle as its sister genre, science fiction, and their popular adopted child, the superhero genre. Where else, other than fantasy, can you watch a wizard command lightning to strike a fire-breathing dragon from the sky, or an army of elves and orcs clashing against each other at the foot of an evil volcano, or a group of fairies dancing under the moonlight? If you're looking for something to entertain and to excite, fantasy is as good a genre to do it with as any other, and it comes with a whole toolbox full of mechanics and tropes exclusive to itself. Fantasy does have its own issues when trying to attract an audience, however. Most obviously, the very fact that the settings can be so fantastical and alien to the audience can be a barrier for entry, especially if the author has a hard time introducing the setting organically to the audience. We're all familiar with the infamous infodump trope, where writers choose to throw entire histories and cultures of the audience in an indigestible block of text, without context or build-up. It's problems like this that can put people off the genre entirely, especially when they run the risk of hitting these steep information curves with every story they consume. Unlike fiction set in our world, which generally share the same history and cultures, whenever you want to dive into a new fantasy adventure, you have a whole new world to learn about. Now, for some people that's incredibly appealing, as it helps differentiate stories from each other and ensure that no two are exactly the same. But for others, it can be incredibly frustrating to have to learn a whole new set of rules for magic, figure out new races and their relations with each other,
or to have to unlearn common assumptions of the genre just because the author wanted to be superficially unique. In cases like these, it helps to provide the audience with a vehicle for which they can gather this information gradually and organically as the story requires. Whilst there are other ways of achieving this, 9 times out of 10 this means that the protagonist has to know as little as the audience in order to be taught this information alongside them throughout the story. After all, the protagonist is the perspective character of this story, the lens through which the audience sees the entire world and plot, so it helps a lot if the two are roughly on the same page as each other. When you have a protagonist that knows more than your audience, it can be frustrating for the audience, either because it feels like information is being withheld from them, or because it leads to clunky expositional dialogue between characters who know something the audience doesn't. You all know the kind, where characters say things like,
"This is Katana! She's got my back! She can cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her."
No one talks like this. So, typically speaking, writers get around this problem by placing their perspective character in an environment different to what they are used to, even if the two environments share the same overall world. Or they can place a character that is knowledgeable and experienced in one particular role in a scenario they are not familiar with, and that their previous skills and experience are not of immediate benefit to them. Alternatively, a writer could always rely on everyone's favourite trope, good old-fashioned amnesia. Yay! What Isekai offers then is a superior solution to the problem of a perspective character. Whilst a modern day person might struggle to relate to the life of a medieval peasant girl or a prince on the run from assassins, it's much easier for us to relate to a character from a fictional version of our own world. It also helps that a person from said fictionalized version of our world would know as little as the audience about the Isekai world going into it, and therefore the audience gets to learn about the world and its rules at the exact same pace as the protagonist. The observant audience member will also notice that the majority of Isekai protagonists are high school boys, and whilst this might largely be due to the target audience of these stories, it also harkens back to the pervasiveness of the high school setting in modern Japanese storytelling. Essentially, high school serves as a common ground for the Japanese audience, a shared experience the majority of the population can easily relate to in some respect. Having your protagonist being of high school age means that, even if some of your audience is too old to directly relate to the protagonist through age alone, they can at least remember a time when they were that age.
The other side of this coin, however, is that Isekai makes for easy wish fulfillment. There's always an aspect of this whenever a story has a protagonist that is intended to be relatable to the audience. Isekai as a genre just seems more willing than most others to tap into the inherent power fantasy of changing from being a generic citizen of a dispassionate modern society to the literal centre of a fictional universe. A quick scan of the Isekai genre will show you just how many of the protagonists are drastically more powerful than any person, obstacle, or other threat they may come across during their adventure. Worse still, a lot of these protagonists will be overpowered from the outset, with maybe only a negligible amount of practice or training needed to adapt to their new power. Even more egregious, the strength of the protagonist comes not from any specialist skill or inherent ability, but some random boon they are presented with as part of their isekai, further making their power seem entirely unearned. Usually this massive increase in power is explained through some sort of RPG-like system that the world seems to operate on occasionally, when the writer feels like it. None of these particular tropes are all that surprising though, really. Considering the prevalence of the fantasy genre in role-playing games, it's not hard to imagine that some writers would take inspiration from these games as much as any other medium. It's also not surprising that, when coming to the ultimate wish fulfillment fantasy world, some would look to video games as a basis for their power dice. Games, more than any other medium I would argue, are fantastic Skinner boxes that can be incredibly rewarding experiences for the audience to participate in, and hardly any game genre recreates the Skinner box better than RPGs. One near universal truth of humankind is that we like it when good numbers go up and bad numbers go down. And hoo boy, do RPGs have a lot of numbers. It can be difficult for people in modern society to feel a sense of progression in their everyday lives. A great deal of the time it might feel like you're stuck in a rut, not really going anywhere, not advancing towards some new objective. You're just kind of getting by. But if you lived in a world that had an RPG style interface, you would always be able to see your experience points rising, your stats growing, and your skills improving. You would also have a clear logical power structure that could be easily understood at a glance. There also comes the general assumption that there is some degree of fairness and potential for upwards mobility in a game system, which might be something you're missing in an important aspect of your ordinary life.
The idea of fairness is probably also tied into the sudden power escalation of the protagonists in these stories. As discussed before, the aim of most of these writers of these stories is to present the audience with a protagonist so painfully average that it's easy for everyone to relate to them on some level. By sticking such a generic person in a world where dragons roam the sky and demon hordes threaten to overwhelm the land is basically a death sentence. So, in order to give the protagonist a chance to not immediately be bear food, they have to be given some capability that allows them to survive long enough to start fulfilling the, well, wish fulfillment part of the story. Some stories will give a protagonist an overpowered ability that they still need to figure out or develop further before they ascend to the near-omnipotent Superman they will almost inevitably become, leaving them to still struggle against fairly small-scale threats to begin with whilst they get a handle on things. Other writers who want to skip over all that and immediately start with their protagonist annihilating entire armies or challenging Satan himself to an arm wrestle will probably just put their protagonist at full power from the start. Or they might give their protagonist some room to grow, like in the previous example, but make it so their basic abilities are so strong that they can face off against large-scale threats from the get-go. Having admitted that the majority of modern isekai stories are simply intended to be popcorn fodder and aren't trying to be particularly extraordinary or revolutionary for the genre, it seems somewhat redundant to attempt poking holes in them. After all, these stories are just trying to be a fun time for the audience, and I'd have to be a real asshole if I was going to ruin other people's fun just for the sake of nitpicking. But I'm gonna do it anyway. As stated before, the main problem most people who complain about the current state of the isekai genre have with it is that isekai is oversaturated with derivative works that don't offer enough of their own original ideas to keep their story fresh. This is not a problem that can easily be solved. The obvious answer to this problem would be for isekai writers to force themselves to spice up their stories with some variety, using settings, scenarios, and character archetypes that aren't quite as common to the genre. Even if you could somehow make the writers bite on that particular challenge, though, it wouldn't inherently fix their storytelling. Writing something different purely for the sake of being different isn't a very effective strategy, and depending on the quality of the writing, it can be very obvious to the audience that the writer doesn't have any way of backing up this choice to be different with any significant depth. It's obviously far better if the writers are writing stories that they've chosen deliberately because they want to write about it and have ideas of what to do with their subject matter. And that's the thing, whilst it's easy to harp on isekai writers for being derivative, that formulaic copy and paste strategy isn't entirely brain dead. When someone writes a story similar to one they've already experienced, it can be a sign that they lack imagination, but they might also be very deliberately choosing elements from popular stories to recreate in their own story because they know people like that stuff and will buy their product if it has that stuff in it. It's the same logic that gives us so many tsundere characters in Japanese romance fiction. It may be shameless pandering, but it's not stupid. So if a writer were to be changing up a character, setting, or scenario for the sake of adding a twist to their isekai story, it would have to be well thought out in order to not seem hollow. When it comes to characters, it makes sense to take advantage of the fact that the protagonist isn't from the same world as the one they are now as a basis for strong character writing. Whilst most protagonists will try not to be too unique in their backstory in order to be accessible for a wider audience, there's no reason why they have to be a cardboard cutout character. The world we live in is a broad and diverse place, so there are plenty of real-world people whose experience a writer could draw upon to create an interesting and compelling character. And that's even assuming your protagonist has to come from our own world. As I said before, there's a whole genre of stories where the protagonist isn't from our world or even human, and whilst the familiar setting might help, these characters are still relatable enough on their own. Whilst it is safer to make your character generic so as not to alienate people in your audience, there's no reason to underestimate your audience's empathy. Humans have a fantastic capacity to form emotional bonds with pretty much anything, even inanimate objects. So long as you give the protagonist a charming character trait or an understandable goal and motive, most people are going to be on board, even if the character isn't remotely like them in any other way. So come on writers, dare to be bold. There are a number of questions that should be carefully considered when writing an isekai story, if you want the writing of said story to be considered better than the average entry into the genre. These include: how many people are being isekai'd, and if more than one, what are their relationships with each other? What was the experience of your characters in their original world, and how does it affect their abilities and competencies in the current world? What means of transportation to the character's experience, and how does this affect the overarching plot of the story? Who summoned the characters and or why were they transported? How did the natives of the world respond to the isekai characters? How many other isekai people already inhabit this world, and how do they interact with each other? What obstacles to adjusting to the new world do the characters face, and does their unique perspective as an outsider offer them any advantages over the natives? Usually when a story fails to address or even consider these types of questions, it comes across that the writer really just wanted to write a fantasy story and steal some quick and easy bonus appeal from the isekai genre. If I have to wonder, why is this even an isekai story to begin with at all whilst experiencing it, then you've probably done a bad job of writing isekai. The isekai genre shouldn't just be a fashion trend, it should be as important a tool in the writer's toolbox as any other genre or trope. Now, I realise I've spent a lot of time going over some general theories and hypotheses about isekai, and whilst it's easy for me to vaguely gesture in the general direction of some good examples of isekai, I imagine my ramblings would make a lot more sense if I were to provide some concrete examples of how isekai can be done poorly. And to be fair, that should be fairly easy for me considering the vast array of low quality isekai stories that have already been released in recent years. If I were so inclined, it would be easy for me to drag out the bloody pulp of a dead horse everyone else has been beating for years. But considering that's a franchise that's already largely ridiculed online and has only produced maybe one good anime series, I think I can do better than that. So instead, I've decided to do something that I'm probably going to regret. I'm going to take on a pretty popular isekai series and explain what I don't like about it. I'm going to explain why Overlord Season 1 was a bad time.